Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about enzymes. More specifically, we're going to be talking about enzyme kinetics. Now, depending on the type of person you are, this is either going to be really exciting for you or it's going to terrify you. So the purpose of this video is to kind of give you an introduction to enzyme kinetics, to wrap your head around some of the more ambiguous concepts. So let's get right into it. All right, so we're actually going to start over here. And the basic schematic that you need to be really familiar with is E plus S, reversible, ES, 2, irreversible, plus P. Now, what does this mean? So breaking each component down, E means enzyme, right? And then S means your substrate. So we already know that enzyme and substrate is going to combine, and then it's going to make a new product, right? Like, let's say the product is this with like a hat. Maybe this is like a transferase, right? So it's going to make a new product. So this is S, this is E, this is P, right? What this reaction schemata is basically saying is that E plus S, so enzyme plus substrate separately, combine to make an enzyme substrate complex. That's what ES means. Now, the enzyme substrate complex isn't always going to catalyze a complete reaction to make your product. Sometimes the substrate is just going to fall back out, right? And this might be due to like just basic molecular collisions. Like it might just be due to the fact that like maybe the conditions aren't as favorable as like the enzyme substrate complex wanted it to be. For various reasons, like this can definitely fall back off, right? But sometimes the reaction goes to completion and then we have an enzyme and then we have a product. Now, for some products, for some enzymes, they can catalyze another thing with this product if they're super like generalized. But remember that the whole point of enzymes is to be super specific, right? Enzymes are biological catalysts that are very specific to the type of substrate that they bind to, or else we just have a generalized enzyme that tries to do everything in our body and our body just wouldn't work, right? It's this specificity that allows enzymes, various types of enzymes, to catalyze various metabolic reactions within our bodies, right? I say all of this to make a point that it's very rare for this product to be able to form a complex with the enzyme once again. And I say this again because you'll notice in our schemata here that this reaction is irreversible, i.e. the product isn't gonna bind back onto the active site of the enzyme. Whereas this reaction, because the substrate can just fall off the catalytic site at times, it is reversible. So that's the general idea of enzyme kinetics that I want you guys to really lock into your brain, okay? All right. With that said, let's go on to see what happens when we have a lot of substrate in the environment or we don't have much substrate in the environment. So the basic idea behind enzyme kinetics is this idea of saturation kinetics. This just means that as there's more substrate available in the enzyme's area, the reaction rate is going to go up. So it's kind of intuitive, right? The more you give the enzyme to work with, so let's say that this pink stuff is the substrate and we have our white enzyme there, right? The more substrate there is to work with, the reaction that this enzyme is going to catalyze, this reaction right here, is going to increase in rate. But does this necessarily mean that this increase in reaction is going to happen forever? I.e., it doesn't mean that the more substrate we put into this environment is the enzyme just going to be able to work faster and faster and faster forever. So this enzyme can only catalyze this reaction like so quickly, right? It's going to probably be forming a lot of product as more and more substrate is in the environment, but at a certain point it's going to hit a wall. Now that wall is called Vmax. This is a good point to go over to our Michaelis-Menten schemata. Now the Michaelis-Menten schemata shows how the rate of the reaction, i.e. how fast can an enzyme work, depending on substrate concentration. So this is exactly the concept that we just talked about, right? As substrate concentration, remember, don't just memorize what the Michaelis-Menten curve looks like. Remember what's on each axis and why it looks the way it does, right? So remember, on the x-axis, we have our substrate concentration. So as substrate concentration increase, i.e. as this pink shit just keeps, coming as it's more saturated, the rate of the enzyme, which is V, the rate at which the enzyme is able to work, increases and increases and increases and increases until it hits a wall, right? So you can add more substrate, but the enzyme is tired. The enzyme's like, listen, like you can feed me as much as you want, but I'm only going to shit out a certain level of product at this point. A fun way to conceptualize this, imagine your favorite boy band, okay? Maybe it's like K-pop, maybe it's BTS, okay? So there's 7 members of BTS. 3, 4, 5. Okay, wow, I can't count. 5, 6, 7, right? 7 members of BTS, and let's say there's like 500,000 fans who came to get their autographs, right? It doesn't matter if you increase this number to 1 million fans. There's only a certain rate at which each member can produce autographs because they're human, right? So enzymes are the same exact way. There is a certain point where they're like, okay, you can feed me more substrate, but there's no way I can do more. That's basically what the Vmax value is here, okay? Now, another interesting value that you need to note is Km. And I feel like a lot of people get freaked out by what Km is, because if you just hear the definition, it's like, oh, it's like the substrate concentration at which like whatever. Just know that Km is an arbitrary label that we gave to a certain substrate concentration value. So Km is the substrate concentration at which Vmax is at its 1/2. So when the enzyme is working as half as much as it can possibly work, that level of substrate concentration is Km. So before we talk about the different types of inhibition, I'm going to quickly touch upon how to conceptualize what the hell a high Km or what the hell a low Km means, right? We're not even going to look at the graph yet because that's just going to confuse you. Let's say we have an enzyme, okay? Let's say three substrate per enzyme. That's the concentration of substrate that this enzyme is working at, Km, right? So this enzyme doesn't need a lot of substrate to be working really hard, i.e. the enzyme really likes to bind with the substrate. Now, intuitively, this should click in your head. It only takes a couple of substrates for the enzyme to be like, okay, yeah, I'm ready to work. i.e. the enzyme really readily binds with the substrate, right? This is an enzyme with a low Km and thus a high affinity. So in that case, what do you think a high Km is going to mean? There needs to be a lot more substrate in the environment for this enzyme to be like, okay, I'm ready to bind. i.e. this enzyme has a lower substrate affinity to this navy substrate, right? This means that there needs to be more substrate concentration in the environment, so Km needs to be high in order for this enzyme to be willing to bind and start progressing these reactions with these Km, okay? So high Km basically means that the enzyme needs to be flooded with substrate for the enzyme to be willing to work with the substrate, right? i.e. the enzyme has low affinity to the substrate. Now, let me give you one of my favorite analogies that I used personally when I was studying enzyme kinetics. Okay, think about your toxic ex situationship. Okay, stay with me now. Think about your most toxic ex situationship. Now, if that ex situationship probably messed up and that's why you're standing on business, I don't know. If you have an ex situationship that you just know, as long as you send them one text, they'll be crawling back to you or they'll be at your door like that. That's gonna be your enzyme with low Km, i.e. high affinity. Because this toxic situationship has such a high affinity to you, as long as you just send one text, they're gonna come back. One is a low number, i.e. they have a low Km, right? It only takes one text. And let's say you have a more toxic situationship where you're maybe a little bit more desperate for, okay? You're hitting their line. You're sending them 10,000 texts a day. You're being like, baby, I'm sorry. Baby, come back. Listen, like whatever. It takes about 100 text messages for them to hit your line back. Okay, this is an enzyme, i.e. this is a toxic situationship that has a low affinity to you. They don't gaff about you, girl, right? So it takes about 100 texts for them to finally reply back once. That is an enzyme, i.e. a toxic situationship that has a low affinity for you, therefore requires a high Km, requires more texts for them to give you a response. So that's kind of a silly way to conceptualize the reciprocal relationship between high Km, low affinity, and then low Km, high affinity. With that out of the way, we're gonna start talking about inhibition. So inhibition, as intuitive as it sounds, is going to be when certain substrates or certain analogs of substrates is going to bother the reaction between you and your toxic situationship. So it's gonna be that other hoe who's trying to take the love of your life, okay? That's what competitive inhibition is. So competitive inhibition is when a substrate analog, i.e. sometimes there exists substrate looking ass things that can also bind to the active site. So your X clearly has a type. So when I say EI here, remember ES meant our enzyme substrate complex. EI means our enzyme inhibitor complex, okay? So this is what competitive inhibition is. So sorry, kind of backtracking. I realized we didn't talk about reciprocal plots earlier. So it's not too scary. Reciprocal plots are literally just taking these two values on the x-axis and taking their reciprocals and plotting them on a linear graph. Now, the only thing that I want you guys to focus on when it comes to this graph is the x and y intercepts. So when you plot the reciprocals of these values on here, your y-intercept becomes 1 over v max, and then your x-intercept becomes negative 1 over km, okay? And then this becomes very relevant soon when we continue to talk about inhibition. As I just mentioned, competitive inhibition is the idea that a thing that looks almost exactly like the substrate binding to the active site of an enzyme, right? So what is that going to do to our reaction scheme? So this pink line is the original substrate. So without this inhibitor, what would the reaction would have looked like versus with the inhibitor, what happens to the reaction? So Vmax stays the same, Km goes up, okay? So let's first see how that translates into our graph. So Vmax stays the same, i.e. our y-intercept is going to remain the same, whereas Km goes up, right? So it's going to shift this way, right? So this is going to be the reaction scheme of your competitive inhibition. Let's talk about why this happens. So when the inhibitor binds to the enzyme substrate place, right? At the end of the day, this enzyme isn't going to catalyze a product from EI, right? So EI is going to just fall off. At the end of the day, the love of your life is still gonna come crawling back to you, and it's gonna prefer to bind to you, right? And then eventually this is going to make a product, right? So at the end of the day, the maximum rate at which the enzyme can do this is going to be the exact same in competitive inhibition, because this is going to fall off and this still exists. But why does Km need to go up? So recall that Km is the amount of substrate that needs to be in the environment for the enzyme to bind to the substrate, right? Or to bind to the substrate at a certain rate that we're talking about. Now, if there's detractors, i.e. if there's inhibitors in the environment, doesn't it intuitively make more sense that there needs to be more substrate in the environment for the enzyme to be at the same level of binding that they used to do before the inhibitor came into the picture? So going back to our toxic situationship analogy, if before it required maybe 50 texts for your situationship to reply back to you, now if your toxic X situationship is involved with another, probably their situationship, because they'll never heal, girl, it's okay. So if they're involved with somebody else, chances are it's probably going to take 70 texts or 70 calls now for them to reply back to you, because they're busying up with somebody else, right? So that's the reason why Km needs to be higher, because there are detractors in the environment, i.e. there exists inhibitors in the environment. There needs to be more substrate for the enzyme to be working at the same level that it was before, i.e. producing product at the same rate that it was before the inhibitor came in. Therefore, there needs to be higher Km. That's why the graph shifts up, right? It shifts towards here. So that's what competitive inhibition is. It's really essential that you guys memorize these shifts in the graph. And I say memorize loosely because as long as you realize why Vmax stays the same and why Km goes up, it's not really a matter of memorizing. It's more of a matter of just applying the concepts. But sometimes if you're on a time crunch, it's good to just have these plots locked into your head. I say all of this because there's a neat trick to remember what the competitive inhibition graph looks like. Do you see how this kind of looks like a C? C stands for competitive. So if you see these kinds of linear graphs on your tests, immediately think competitive inhibition, okay? We're gonna talk about the next type of inhibition, which is kind of weird to wrap your head around, okay? So it's uncompetitive inhibition, not non-competitive, not hyper-competitive or hypo-competitive or whatever the hell. We're talking about uncompetitive inhibition. And I don't know who the hell named these things, and I don't like it either. But uncompetitive inhibition is basically when the inhibitor is only able to bind to the enzyme substrate complex. So we have our normal enzyme substrate complex here where it'll proceed normally and it'll probably, make a pretty little product here. Whereas if there's an inhibitor that binds to the enzyme substrate complex only, then this isn't going to form a product, right? I personally like to visualize the inhibitor as kind of a lid. Because the inhibitor is trapping the substrate inside the enzyme, this enzyme can't, this entire complex won't be able to form a product, right? So that's how the inhibitor kind of works in this situation. Whereas before, the inhibitor literally doesn't let the substrate bind to the active site. This time, the inhibitor is letting them bind. In fact, it needs them to bind for them to work, but it's not letting them progress here. That's what uncompetitive inhibition is. It kind of waits for its chance, and as soon as the substrate kind of binds, then it kind of pounces on the entire thing and lets them not be happy and form a product, okay? That's what uncompetitive inhibition is. Now, looking at our graph once again, in uncompetitive inhibition, Vmax is going to go down and Km is also going to go down. Now, this might be a little bit less intuitive to understand. Let's first talk about why Vmax goes down. So recall that Vmax is dependent on how much product an enzyme can form, right? That's basically what I mean by reaction rate. How fast is the enzyme able to form a product? Do you see here when the inhibitor binds to this, the enzyme can't form a product, point blank period, right? So the rate at which this enzyme can form a product is going to go down because once I binds to the substrate complex, this enzyme is being used up, but it's not forming a product in the first place. That's why Vmax is going to go down. Now, why does Km go down? Recall that Km is basically the affinity. It basically represents the affinity the enzyme has for the substrate, right? Do you see how when we put a lid on the enzyme substrate complex, i.e. we put an inhibitor, an uncompetitive inhibitor on the enzyme substrate complex, it seems like it's binding more tightly, right? i.e. Km is going to go down. Now, if we want to go back to our toxic situationship analogy, think of this as like a toxic friend that's convincing you to stay in that relationship. So yeah, your ex came back to you, and then you're clearly not good for each other, but there's this like detractor that once you guys get back together, this detractor is being like, no, you guys are like so perfect for each other. Now, I don't know why a friend would do that, but at the same time, just think that this inhibitor is op in that sense. It's basically making you bind tighter to your toxic situationship, and that's why your Km goes down. Because obviously, once you're bound tightly, then you only have to send like one text for your situationship to like reply back to you, right? Because your friend is in your ear being like, no, you have to stay with them, like they're great for you, whatever. That's basically what an inhibitor does, right? Now, this friend is weird because when the substrate and the enzyme aren't together, i.e. when you're not talking to your situationship, they don't really have much to say. But once you are together again, this is your toxic friend in your ear being like, never leave him, he's great for you, i.e. making you bind tighter to the enzyme substrate. If you're bound tighter, if you and your situationship are closer together, and it's more likely that you guys are going to reply to each other at any point in time, your Km is going to be low because you only have to send one text for them to reply to you. That's why your Km is low, because the inhibitor is increasing or seemingly increasing the enzyme substrate affinity. I say seemingly there because at the end of the day, this isn't going to form products. So yeah, it can bind tightly all you want, but if it's not forming product, then what is it doing, right? Vmax efficiency is going down, but affinity is going up, so nothing's really happening, but you guys are closer together than ever. Sound familiar? I know, story of my life. All right, we're gonna move on to non-competitive inhibition, okay? So we had uncompetitive and non-competitive. Now, before we do that, I wanna give you like a similar trick that I gave you for competitive here. So uncompetitive, because these two are in parallel lines, does it kind of look like a U, right? So there's a C, there's a C, and then there's your U. We're going to talk about non-competitive inhibition. So there was uncompetitive and now there's non-competitive inhibition. Now, non-competitive inhibition is going to bind at an allosteric site. So basically think of the inhibitor as a detractor for forming product, right? But it can still form product just at a lower rate. And it's not going to bind to the catalytic site, i.e. the substrate can still bind to the catalytic site just fine. What only changes here is that once the enzyme is bound to a inhibitor, then it's not able to form product as efficiently, but it's still able to bind the substrate with the same affinity. Let's say you're running a mile. Now, already some of you are like, that's not me. I never run a day in my life. Girls, same. But let's say you're running a mile, okay? Let's say the enzyme is you and your ability to run a mile quickly. And then let's say the substrate is your phone or your ability to listen to music. You're one of those people who refuses to run unless you have something playing in your ear, okay? So that's basically your substrate, right? So think of the inhibitor in this case as a weighted vest. Now, is a weighted vest going to alter your ability to listen to music while you run this mile? i.e., is it going to alter your ability to bind to the substrate? No. But is it going to slow you down? Yes. So basically think of this inhibitor as a completely separate thing from your ability to bind to the substrate to do whatever the substrate. What it's going to alter is the rate at which you can produce this. So intuitively, that should make sense in the sense that Vmax, i.e. your catalytic efficiency, i.e. the rate at which you can produce your product is going to go down. Whereas your Km, your ability to listen to music, your ability to bind to the substrate is going to stay exactly the same. How does that translate over to our plot? Here, Km stays the exact same. So we have a common point here, whereas Vmax is going to go down. So your 1 over Vmax is going to shift up. Never get confused by this. I feel like this is where people get confused a lot, and this is where people lose the most points. Because your Y reciprocal is 1 over Vmax, it's going to shift up. Okay, remember, 1 over 2 is bigger than 1 over 3, while 3 is not bigger, sorry. 3 is bigger than 2. See, I get confused too. It's okay. But always remember that when Vmax goes down, 1 over Vmax is going to shift up, and that's going to be your new reaction line, okay? Last neat trick for this one. So recall that competitive inhibition, we memorized it because C is in the little front quartile, whereas, not the quartile, sorry, quadrant. C is in the little quadrant, right? U spans both quadrants, right? That's your U. And then non-competitive is this entire thing. Do you see how it kind of looks like an N, like an incomplete N? That's how you kind of like can kind of commit it to memory. Okay, so I apologize for the out-of-pocket analogies, but I do hope that was kind of useful in some sense. But that's a basic overview of enzyme kinetics. As always, let me know if you guys want any more specific videos on any more specific topics. As long as it's in the basic biochemistry/science ranges, I'll be able to help you out.